Good morning, everyone. I'm Jessica Brooks, the Educational Services Librarian at South Central Regional Library Council in Ithaca, New York. Welcome to the By the Numbers Quantitative Assessment in Libraries webinar from the NY3Rs Association. If you have any questions or comments during the talk today, you can type them into the question area of your command module, and I'll be monitoring them for our speaker. And now I would like to introduce Mary Carol Lindblom, the Executive Director of South Central Regional Library Council.
Thanks, Jessica. Good day, everyone. I hope that your weather is as beautiful as it is here in Ithaca, at least at this moment. It can change, but it is gorgeous here in every sense of the word. I will introduce today's instructor in a moment, but first a word about our sponsoring organization, the NY3Rs Association, Inc. Today's webinar is part of a series, as you may know, Practical Library Assessment, and that in turn is part of an assessment and outcomes initiative funded by the NY3Rs organization. And the organization represents the 9 multi-type library systems of New York State. So for more information about the NY3Rs and to see our other initiatives, visit www.ny3rs, as in Sam.org. You may also check their site or SCRLC's, us, for registration information on the upcoming webinars in this series. So the next one will be July 10th, starting at 10:30 Eastern Time, and then the one after, and that'll be on survey design, and then the one after that is July 22nd at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. So please circle those times on your calendar. The first one on survey design, the second one on focus groups. So Wendi Ackerman first presented for us on assessment at this past New York Library Association pre-conference and was amenable to expanding her presentation for a webinar audience. Thank you for that, Wendi. Wendi is the Deputy Director at the Upstate Health Sciences Library in Syracuse, New York. She began her career with SUNY Libraries in 1999 at SUNY Oswego, where she worked first as a librarian and then as the campus web coordinator. 11 years ago, she joined Upstate, having worked in nearly every area of that library. At the moment, she seems to oversee just about everything, information resources that includes collection acquisitions, library systems, interlibrary loan, and she coordinates library assessment. So, without further ado, I turn the program over to Wendi.
Thank you, Mary Carol. Good morning, everyone. My hope is that all of you will at least take something away from this morning's webinar, whether you have experience with assessment or whether it's new to you. I lost a few of my PowerPoints, so I'll be doing a little bit more talking than I planned, but we will cover everything anyway. So with that in mind, let's get started. In this session, I'll talk a little bit about what quantitative assessment is, where to find data, how to look at it, some ways that you can apply it. I'll tell you some of the things that we learned in our library since we've been working on assessment here. I have some resources at the end that I found really helpful when I was working on this, and hopefully there'll be time for questions at the end. There are 2 types of library assessment, or 2 types of assessment in general. You have the qualitative assessment and you have quantitative assessment. Both are very important, and you need both to get the whole picture. Qualitative assessment gets to the way people perceive or feel about something. It can measure intangible things like level of satisfaction, enjoyment, confidence, and that kind of thing. These types of measures will be covered in other sessions because quantitative is just too big. You can't do both quantitative and qualitative all in 1 hour. So we're going to just be looking at metrics today. Qualitative assessment is mainly about how people use your resources, the how many, the how long, the how often, the how much. So you look at things like how many times someone comes to your library, how many books are checked out, how many times someone searches a database, maybe how long they stayed in the library, how many times they've visited your website, how many reference questions have been asked. that kind of thing. It also includes the inputs, the things that the library invests in. So you're also going to look at things like how much money does it cost to buy books, how much money does it keep the library open. And within this realm of metrics, there are 4 different types. There's inputs, outputs, processes, and outcomes. And it all begins with your inputs. This is our slide with all of our inputs. You have things like staff, you have your facility, you have your technology, you have your collections, of course, and your website. And these are all the things that you're spending money on. And pretty much anything that's an input, there's going to be a cost associated with it, because you do have to pay staff, you do have to pay to have your website hosted and all that kind of thing. So even though it may not seem as though there's a cost associated with it, generally there's always a cost associated with your inputs. And even things like salaries, like you have to remember that staff have salaries and benefits. Buildings have utilities and maintenance costs. Websites require staff and technology, they're not just there. So there's all these hidden costs you might need to think about too. Outputs are the things that people tend to think of when they think of assessment. These are your gate counts, your circulation statistics, use of electronic resources. But we consider them outputs because there's no value placed on these numbers. They're just counts. They're just describing your patrons' activities. So they're just describing how they're using the resources that you're providing them and how they're using the things that you're providing inputs for. This is a really good slide. This is one of the best examples of outputs that I've ever come across. The other type of metrics that you might want to look at are process metrics. The process metrics are where you turn inputs into outputs. So if you take interlibrary loan and you look at this as an example, you can see each step. So when you want to think about each step, you want to stop and think about how many staff are involved, how long does each take, what are the costs associated with each one. You might want to think about the technology, which programs are being used. And it's helpful to go through and look at each one and see, is one taking longer than it should? Are your inputs not becoming outputs like you would want them to? Is there something that you can do better? So that's the kind of assessment you might want to look at when you're looking at process. When it comes to ILL, the major parts are going to be the technology, but the other major part is going to be your staff time. And the outputs from ILL are going to be the number of items that are borrowed or loaned. And then the outcome, which we are going to next, are all the happy customers who quickly get what they needed from interlibrary loan. So let's look at outcomes. Outcomes measure the impact. They can be qualitative or quantitative, but since we're just talking about quantitative today, you want to think in terms of things like student grades, employment, money saved or revenue generated, anything that shows an impact on your customers, things that you did to make their lives better. And if you can show it in numbers like this slide does, that's great. So before we switch gears, let's take a quick look at a summary of the metrics that we already looked at. Your inputs are your money, your outputs, your processes, and your outcomes. And I know this is actually quite helpful when it comes to start looking at all this stuff, is to have an idea of what you're looking at, whether it's an input, an output, a process, or an outcome. So where does the data come from? Data is everywhere. It really is everywhere. And the more you get used to looking for it, the more you'll see it. It's embedded in most library systems. It is embedded in most library systems. You're probably already collecting manually. I know we have counting days where we just click off tick sheets, which isn't exactly high tech, but it works. And everything that you pay for in the library, that's a metric too. So your library administration probably has lots and lots of data that you could use. The other thing you might want to think about is don't forget to look outside of the library, especially information about your customers and their communities. A lot of that can come from census data, or in my case, we get a lot of our information from human resources, and we get a lot of information from the registrar's office. So if we look at the systems a little bit closer, the OPAC, or I guess more appropriately would be the library management system that the OPAC is running off of, and the ILL system are pretty self-explanatory. Data is an integral part to them. And the systems that are there, they have the built-in reports. So I think a lot of us are pretty used to using those systems. The other system that we use here a lot, and we pull a lot of data from it, even though the data is actually a byproduct, we use our Easy Proxy logs in order to mine a lot of data. Easy Proxy is what we use for off-campus authentication. So it has extensive log files that can be configured to collect all kinds of data. Right now we are using them to collect URLs, so we know what resources people are using. We can see their IP addresses, so we kind of know where they're coming from. It has detailed timestamps, so we can see when people are using our information. And it even picks up search terms from many of our databases. The problem with Easy Proxy is that the information in the logs is not really meant to be in a report, so you kind of have to work a little harder at getting the data out of it. So we have to run a bunch of custom reports. But there's a lot of really good information there, and it's something that people don't tend to think of as far as a source of information. Other sources of data are online content providers. I know with us, because most of our collections are in electronic format, we rely very heavily on usage reports from vendors and publishers. These days, most comply with the Counter standard that started in 2002, which is really helpful. It's in its 4th release now, but the Counter compliance ensures that you are comparing apples to apples, because everyone is recording and reporting the data the same way, which is really helpful. Otherwise, you just don't know. Are they counting downloads the same way? Are they counting use the same way? So it's really hard to tell. But most of the regionals these days are Counter compliant, and most of the databases seem to be coming around also. There isn't much you can do about resources that are non-compliant and have stats that are not Counter compliant. And there's really not much you can do if your resources aren't giving you stats at all. Sometimes you can get a little bit of information out of serial solutions or whatever it is you're using for an open URL resolver, but it's kind of just better than nothing. So hopefully, whatever you're looking at will be Counter compliant and you'll be in good shape. As I mentioned, most of us are using homegrown tools to collect data, whether it be Excel spreadsheets, paper tally sheets, and I know we use Google Forms for some of ours also. The biggest challenge of these kind of homegrown systems is to find out where they're hiding in the library. People tend not to think about them or mention that they're using them. They just kind of get in the habit of using them, and then you find out much later that they have this data, and it's good data, but you didn't know it was there. So the challenge is to unearth them and figure out what do people have and use it. Some of these data collection tools that are available are fee-based. That would be like the Lib Analytics. The ARL has some good tools which are fee-based as well. The Lib Analytics is actually quite reasonable, and we use there's like different levels. We have the lower level. The Lib Analytics is really just kind of like Google Forms with built-in reports, which is kind of nice. We use it because we like the built-in reporting. But the ARL statistics also are good if you can afford it. A lot of the academic libraries really like it, and they do offer a lot of support, and they do offer you a lot of help as far as deploying the instruments and reporting on the data. Another source of data is the operational data that we mentioned earlier. And we're back at inputs. As mentioned, that this operational information can include anything like what hours you're open, library sources of income and the funding, and includes everything that you spend your money on. So print and electronic resources, salaries and benefits, professional development, and even things like the light, the heat, and the phone bill. Any kind of marketing materials that you might buy, and all the way down to pens, pencils, and paper clips. All of this is recorded somewhere, and it all goes into your inputs, and it all has to do with making the library go. Now back to some of the external data. They tend to offer, most of the external data tends to offer information mostly about your patrons or about your potential patrons and the world that they live in. So you can look to things like the government for census data. And as I was saying, we look to the registrar, and we also look to human resources for a variety of demographics. We actually match up some of our data from some of the other databases so that we can pull in demographic information from HR, and we match it all up within, I think it's a MySQL somewhere. We have someone who does it. It's fantastic. So it's good to think about the data sources that are outside of your own library if you can. If you think, you just have to think beyond the library sometimes, even though it can be hard to overlook that. Now that you know to mine your data from your systems, download the electronic resources usage, track down all that homegrown data from all the collection tools that people are hiding from you, and to look at operational inputs and external data, you're ready to move on to some analysis. It can be helpful to think of analysis in terms of what the story is telling you. The data is telling you a story. It could be telling you what books are flying off the shelves or never actually landing anywhere except for the hold shelf. Like, what are the most popular items? It could be talking to you about your door count. You might want to know who is, oops, sorry. I lost my slides, so I'm still trying to recover here. It's going to tell you what your door count is, which is good information. This is all, what you're seeing here, this is all single level data. It's just giving you totals. So it's very descriptive. It's just descriptive data that's telling you how many items have circulated, how many people have come through the door, how many reference questions were asked, interlibrary loan, and computer reservation, that kind of data. It's a single level of data, which is good information, and you are going to learn something from it. But you're going to learn even more if you can combine your variables. This is when you get into things like circulation, but you want to know by type or subject so you can do some collection development. And it might be helpful to know, are you getting all new customers, all repeat customers, or do you have some new customers? And if you have some new customers, if you could get in touch with them and find out what's bringing them in so you can keep it up. For reference questions, you might want to know by hour or day of week so that you have your desk staffed appropriately and people are there when you need them. And another interesting question is what % of your registered patrons are using your interlibrary loan? Are they aware that it's there? If they're not using it, either you have a really super good collection development person and your collections are perfect, or they just don't know it's there. But until you look further and get to the story, you don't know why it is that they are not using your ILL. So these are the kind of things you want to take a look at, like what is the story? And sometimes you have to dig a little deeper. Like you might need to go out and contact some of your new and your repeat customers and find out why are you coming and and if they've come once and you know their address, maybe you can reach out to them and send them a postcard and say, hey, I see that you are here. We want to have you back, and why are you not coming in? Sometimes you can refer them to a website and get some more information through a web survey or something like that as well. So when it comes to data analysis, the other thing you want to look at, aside from just descriptive data, there's actually 4 things. You have your descriptive data, you have your trends, you have your benchmarking, and you want to look at return on investment. So we talked about the descriptive data. Trends are basically just descriptive data over time. So you're going to start a baseline, and then you're just going to follow it through and keep track, like what is going up and what is going down and that kind of thing. So you have to take a look and see, like, where is it that you are? And we want to take a look at things like what's changing and what isn't changing. How quickly is it changing? And if it's changing, if you're seeing changes, and especially if you're seeing them quickly, it's probably a good idea to jump in and figure out what's going on. If it's a good change, you want to keep doing the same thing. And if it's a negative change or something you weren't expecting, it's good to intercede as quickly as possible. And trend data can be even used for things like collection development, which we'll look at later. Benchmarking, which I had a slide for, and now I do not. Let me find my notes. Benchmarking is a comparison to peer libraries who are either very similar to yours already or an aspirational peer, someone who you want to emulate. In the first case, it can be informative to compare the inputs and outputs and to look at the similarities and differences between the libraries. It might make you look at things differently or make different decisions about your own library. Sometimes it's helpful too to make a case if you think your budget is not quite up to where it should be. If you look at a peer library and you can say, this is a peer library, their budget is this and ours is not. So sometimes that's also very helpful information to have. In the second case, if you want to catch up or even surpass another library's accomplishments, What you need to know is where you are now, how far you have to go, and then you can make a plan to get there. So if you have this benchmarking against your aspirational peer, you know we are at this point of the process, and this is where we want to be. And you can, if you plan all your steps in between, the important thing to do is not to forget to measure your progress along the way. So return on investment. For our return on investment, I just learned this trick from one of the books that was in the list of resources at the end, and I thought it was a really great number. So what is this book really worth? We pay, the cost to us for this book, this Harrison's Principles of Internal Medicine, is $238. That includes purchasing it and processing it. And we have 1,200 medical students, first and second year students, all of whom this is a required textbook for them. So if you figure that 1,200 students can use this copy of this very expensive textbook that we have on closed reserve at the library, that one book saved our students a total of $285,600, which I think is not bad for a $238 investment on our part. We're looking at our leisure reading collection for every year we do a document that kind of summarizes some of the things that we've done in the library over the year. And we've just added a lot to our leisure reading collection. It's been very popular. It's actually more popular than our medical books, interestingly enough. But we're going to apply the same metric to our leisure reading collection so we can get the word out to people that an average book for us, I believe, costs about $19 for our leisure reading collection. If it's borrowed 300 times, then it's worth $5,700. So that $19 book you've turned into an almost $6,000 book. So if you look at the spread out over an entire collection, it could be worth almost $1 million, even if we spent only about $3,000 on those books at the initial investment. So this is kind of an interesting way to look at the return on investment, because you really want to see like the money that you're putting in, what are you getting back out for your money? Another way we like to look at our return on investment is interlibrary loan. For us, interlibrary loan is a huge cost saver. It's actually quite embedded in our collection development policy. So basically, if we can afford to borrow it through interlibrary loan more cheaply than buying the cost per use is going to be for an annual subscription, then we just go with the interlibrary loan. So in 2013, we borrowed 9,560 articles from 1,1080 unique journals. The average cost of a journal subscription is about $1,300 annually, and there's a number for that, which I have a reference for. And so if we had to subscribe to all 1,080 of those journals, instead of subscribing, and if we had to subscribe to them and we're not able to interlibrary loan them, the cost works out to about $2 million. So even with the borrowing cost figured in, it saves our ILL department saves us well over $1 million in potential subscription costs annually, which is a fantastic number. The cost per use actually works really well as far as speaking to faculty about subscriptions. We get requests all the time to add journals. And even if we do add a journal, before we turn it on, we let them know that we will do it for a year, but we monitor cost per use. If the cost per use is above what it would cost interlibrary loan at the end of that year, then we will have to cancel it. But we let them know, like you need to use it at least 35 times or at least 135 times or something, so they're well aware of how many times they have to use it. And most of the time, we get to keep it, which is good. So we're educating our faculty a lot, and most of them are pretty good about it once they find out how much things cost. Another interesting cost per use tool is from the ALA. I saw this in the last webinar that someone did, and I checked it out, and actually it's very, very good. It's the ALA Library Value Calculator. I will put a link to it in my PowerPoint before I send it off. And what you can do is when you get there, you can generate 20 different values, both from collections and services, so there's different metrics that you can generate. And it's very helpful, even if the numbers that you might want to check to make sure that the numbers match up to your what you pay, because it does tell you where their numbers came from. If your books cost more money, you might want to do it yourself and just use their metric, but add your own cost information in. but still, it gives you some really good ideas about ways that you can measure value if you're just looking for some ideas. So how else can you use your analysis? Your analyses, your descriptive data, your trends, your return on investments. Oh, I guess we're going to talk about this one. Let's see. We do a lot of, in addition to cost per use data, we do a lot of inflationary trend data. What this does is we do keep very close track of, especially our more expensive subscriptions and more expensive licenses. We keep very close track each year of how much the inflation goes up, and we trend it out. So what happened was we have a very expensive point of care database called UpToDate. And we're pretty sure, based on our history with them and watching the inflation go up and up and up really quickly in the last, especially in the last 5 to 6 years, that at the end of a 3-year contract, we are not going to be able to afford to buy it anymore. So what this inflationary trending data has done is it's giving us a window. So we have 3 years to transition our very large population of UpToDate loyalists over to alternative databases. So keeping track of that and trending it is really helpful. Like we saw it coming from a mile away. So we were completely prepared, and we're getting ready for the pushback, because they're not going to want to give it up, but by then we will already have our ducks in a row, and we will have everything ready to go, and it's all because we kept track and we knew exactly what was going to happen with that database. The other thing that we use a lot of trending data for is we have a good idea of when our library is the busiest, and our reference librarians do a really good job of keeping track of the type of questions that come in. So they know we have a really good handle on when we need them here. So we pretty much have decided that we only need to be here business hours, which is kind of nice, and that we just don't get enough traffic in the evenings. It's mostly because our population, a lot of them are clinical, so we get the clinical people that come in during business hours or that need our help during business hours. So we've been pretty good about making sure that we have people when we need them, so that we're not adding unnecessary reference staff for weekends and that kind of thing. So we know when we need people, we have them here. And the other thing that we've been keeping an eye on is it going to be cheaper at some point, especially when we have a lot of distance learning, to join something like Reference 24/7 or to use some kind of chat technology. So there is a cost there. We're thinking there'll probably be a cost savings there. So we're comparing the trends of when we're needed here, and then we're going to combine that with variables as to how much will it cost to add another person, or how much will it cost to instead rely on some technological solution. So that's another way that you can kind of combine your data and figure out what you need to do and optimize your resources. I believe that because I am lacking some PowerPoint slides, I have gotten through more than I would normally have quickly, but as far as the data analysis goes, we really are just looking at the descriptive data, the trends, and the benchmarking, and we've talked about different ways you can use them. If anybody has any questions about what we're doing, I would be happy to answer them. But I am going to move on to the tips and unsolicited advice section.
Wendi, do you want to take a couple minutes and answer a couple questions that came up first?
Yeah, that would be great. Everybody can look at the big bad wolf in the meantime.
Okay.
Sure.
So Barbara Petrozelli was wondering, how do you get data about other libraries to use as benchmarks?
So a lot of that is online, especially if we are part of the it's ASL. It's the American Association of Health Sciences Libraries, and all the data that we feed in goes into a larger database, and so we can get the information back out from them also. So we all kind of share data, and I believe that most of the library associations do the same thing. I believe the Public Library Association has a similar thing, and I believe that the ALA also does the same thing. So mainly it's through library associations, and sometimes you can even just identify who your your peer libraries or who the person is that you're interested in. Sometimes they'll just help. They may just share information with you just because they're generous with their information. But mostly we get our information through the Oslo network, and we just get it right from the survey data that everyone is submitting. But we're all submitting it together to the same place.
Right, and there was another webinar in the series called Using Data that discussed some of these services that you can use to get that data, and I'll type in all of those recordings are archived on the NY3R's YouTube page, and I will put that into the chat box. And Barbara was also wondering, how do you track number of journal uses?
We do that pretty much all of our journals are online. We don't have, if it's in print, we throw it away, so we don't keep track of it anyway. But we do all the stuff that's online. We get all those numbers either from the online content providers. We either download them. Unfortunately, it takes a really long time because you do have to go to each one individually. So we just go to each database and each journal, and we just download the statistics, and we put them all together in a giant Excel spreadsheet, which we started many years ago. Now we just kind of add to it each year. We just add a new column for the following year. So that's where those come from. If we don't have them from the online content provider, we do either use Serial Solutions, because that will tell you something. At least you know something is happening with that title. So if it's getting a lot of use through Serial Solutions, that means it's probably getting even more than you think, because people aren't necessarily always going through Serial Solutions. They may be going right there. So if we get some information from our Serial Solutions, we just tack on more and say, well, if it's getting this much, it must be getting more. And if there are none at all, we try to work easy proxy magic, and we'll go in and look and see, like, how many times from off campus did someone click on this link and log in. So mostly, thank goodness, they're coming from the content providers, but we do kind of jump through some hoops if we need to. If we desperately need the data, we'll get it wherever we can get it from.
Great, thanks. Those are the only questions so far.
The only ones so far. I'm really kind of bummed I lost some of my slides. So I will start. At least I can talk about some of the things that we have learned. I don't know if, I'm sure it's different in other environments, but these are the things that we have learned as we've been going through the assessment process. The first one is very important to collect only the data that you have. Do not collect data that you have no plans to use. If you're not going to use it, don't collect it. It's kind of like crying wolf. And you're going to get more buy-in from people, both the staff and your customers and your patrons, if you use what you're collecting. If you just collect it, they're going to think, it's hard to keep track of what's the important and what isn't if you just collect it and you store it, and they know that it's not being used for anything. It kind of waters down the importance of the information that you will be collecting. So we learned pretty quickly not to collect anything we don't need that, and you have to maintain it and keep track of it. And no one wants to maintain and keep track of anything extra. The other thing we did, not right at the beginning, but later on, which was really, really super helpful. It's good to inventory the data that's already being collected. So the sooner you can do this at the beginning, the better. We originally tried it in an Excel spreadsheet, but an Excel spreadsheet is very flat. So all you could do is make columns, and this mind map software does a much, much better job. So you can get different layers. You can layer out the data. It's much easier to see. You can actually kind of see it, and you can move it around and see it in relation to one another. So if you can create yourself a map of all the data that you have already, it's really helpful. You might find that there's something you didn't even know you were doing. It's kind of interesting, like, I didn't know I had this information. And it's good if you can get as many people as possible involved, because we're not all using the resources the same way, especially with systems, because you have the people that are using the systems from the front end, and then you have the people that are using it from the back end, and they're all going to be aware of different information that's there, and they just have, it's just good to get all the different perspectives as you can when you're doing this, because the more you know, the less you're going to duplicate your efforts. What we found at some point is that we were collecting all this information, and it turned out that it was also being collected in another system. So we were unfortunately collecting data we weren't going to use, because it turned out we had better data very similar in another system. So this is a good thing to do, is to figure out exactly what you have and put as much of it out there as possible. I had to shorten this map a little bit because it wouldn't fit on the slide, but this was a really, really good exercise, especially once we had a whole bunch of people involved. Let's see. The other thing I learned, pretty quickly is to choose what you want to assess before you start, and start small, because it can be really overwhelming, especially if your library has a strategic plan. Don't try to do the whole strategic plan at once. Even if you do, even trying to put together, it turns out an assessment plan can be a little overwhelming if you're very new to this. There's just so much, because you can be completely overwhelmed with data. So if you start out with just a couple things and just work your way up. Start, if possible, with 2 or 3 things, and what's really good is if you can pick something that you know is going to be a success, something that you can show everybody. We measured this, and look how good. Like, we look really great. It's a good way to get the ball rolling, and it's also another chance to get some buy-in. Anytime you can get buy-in, it really, really, really helps. So the other one, I used the same slide because we still want people to be successful. And it's really important. I know it might sound self-explanatory to make it easy for people, but it's easy to overlook that. If you put together a survey tool or something, and you put it out there and you ask the staff, keep track of all the people that come to the desk today. But then they have to log in or they can't find it. So the easier you make it, the less frustrated they're going to be, the more likely they are to actually do what you need them to do. So this is actually really helpful. The other thing that we found that makes it easier for people is to gently remind them until it becomes a habit. So we don't really hound them too much, but at least we will remind them gently. Like, don't forget to fill out your survey, and don't forget to check off the questions when they come in. So the easier it is, and to train them to use it. And testing is a good thing too. So a lot of times they actually enjoy to be part of the testing process. And all of these things are just more reasons for them to have buy-in. And the more buy-in you can get, the more data that you're going to get that's good, and the more help you're going to get from everybody on your library team. The other thing that we learned, I'm not sure how we figured this out, but you always want to measure performance as a team or a library as a whole. Sometimes individual performance can get kind of caught in the crossfire by mistake, and you don't mean to be doing. You're not setting out to go measure someone's department and their individual performance within their department. But sometimes when you're looking at things like, how long did it take to answer that reference question? Sometimes people think, oh, well, you're checking to see if I took too long to answer that question. So it's really helpful if you can figure out how to do it, so you really are measuring a team as a whole. And this is another way. It's all about buy-in. This is another way to get people to buy in, especially if you're showing that their team is doing a really great job. And another thing that we discovered is that it's really helpful if you have an owner for your data. If you assign someone to be the owner of whatever that data collection tool. This is especially important, we found, with Lib Analytics, because there's a lot of, you have to follow up, make sure people are doing it, make sure people are filling it out. So it's always good to have someone that's going to check in on your data entering people periodically to make sure that it's really happening. And it's good to have them check to make sure that the data looks right and that there's not some problem with it, because sometimes you look at it and you think, oh, I don't know what happened here. So that's another thing where expertise comes in. If your owner has expertise in that area, that's even better, because if you have someone who's collecting the information about the front desk and what's happening at the front desk, if it's someone who's there all the time, they're going to know if the data is being collected, if it's being collected consistently, and if it's being collected in a correctly. So it's good to have an owner, especially someone who really, really knows what's going on in that area. And then they're also more likely to run reports. You can get them up and running, and they actually enjoy running reports a lot of the time if it's their area and it's their area of expertise. They have that interest in actually maintaining it and doing a good job. The other thing, so it's good too for the feedback. It's good to ask for feedback from your data owners and your collectors periodically, and not just rely on the owner. It's good to check in with them, like have the owner be in charge, but still check in with them just to make sure everything's going okay, because it turns out people will assume that you know that there's a problem, and it turns out you don't. Like, there could be a problem and you just don't know what's happening, and they just think, oh, they know what's happening and it's fine. So it turns out that sometimes they have good intentions, they just think we're all over it and on top of it, and it turns out we're not. So it's always good to check in. You can never check in. Well, you probably can check in too much, but it's still good to check in. The other thing that I discovered is when you start something new, you should run a report as soon as possible. Because if you can't get a good report out of a system, then you're probably doing something wrong with the collection tool. This is another one that I found with Lib Analytics. If you're not collecting the information properly, you just can't get a good report. So you're spending all this time walking around the library counting people, and then you are not able to do anything with it. So it's always good to test to make sure that the data is going in so that it will come out nicely. Otherwise, it's not doing you much good. So if you can test it right at the beginning, you should go for it and test it. Oh, and it looks like I am already at the end of my resources. All of these things, these top 3 books especially are written. The top 4 books especially are great. The one at the top, the Managing Data book, is actually from 2015, so it's brand new. And what it does is it actually walks you through running reports on the PLA metrics site and on the ALA metrics site. So they show you how to log in and what to do with the data, and they make suggestions about reports you can run and how you can use them. It's fantastic. The Evaluation and Measurement of Library Services, that one's very good too. Getting Started with Evaluation is relatively new, and it really is like kind of a beginner's book. So it's nice and it's short, so you can get through it fast. The book I really like, but just the end, is the Viewing Metrics from different perspectives. The book itself is very long, but at the end, the appendices are fantastic. They give you menus. They give you menus of things that are inputs that you can study. They give you menus of outputs. They give you menus of outcomes. They can look at the data from the library's perspective, and they look at these things from the customer's perspective. So they give you all these different ways you can look at data. You can almost just go in and just go down right through and just pick a menu of things that you want to do. And it's really helpful, especially when you're creating the mind map of the things that you're collecting. It kind of gives you cues like, oh yeah, we're collecting that. And then you can go back and add it to your map because it's a very, very, very thorough list. It's highly recommended. I added the PLA project outcome to the list just because I know that they're working on some new stuff, and it looks pretty interesting, and it really is all about outcomes, which I think is great. And Library Edge gives you some tools that are very helpful. I will add the link for the ALA's library data value calculator. That's what it is. And the other thing, the other resources I added on here are mostly about statistics. Once you start doing a lot with statistics, you're going to get bigger data sets, and it really does kind of help to have a refresher in some of the stuff that you learned a long time ago that you probably haven't used in a while. So there's a lot of good free sites out there. The Khan Academies is very good. It's kind of short, and you get through it pretty quickly, but it's a very good one also. So that one's recommended. There are others too and other MOOC sites, but this one's a good place to start. So if you start feeling overwhelmed, it might be time to go out and get a little statistics refresher. So even though I missed a few slides, which are home on my computer, and you guys would love them if you could see them, I think I've covered pretty much everything. I tried to get through all the types of the metrics, different places you can find it, different ways that you can analyze it, how you can apply it, and many of these help sites. So I'm hoping that there was something that you were able to take away from this webinar. And if anybody has any more questions, let me know. Otherwise, I will also answer any emails if you want to send me a question later on.
There are a couple more questions for you, Wendi.
I like questions.
Nancy Berkowitz would like to know, can you expand the ROI for circulation discussion?
Yes, I'm not sure. Can you repeat the question?
Can you expand the ROI for circulation discussion?
Oh, yes, like what we're going to do with it for our leisure reading collection, I'm guessing.
I think that's what she was referring to. Yeah.
So we figured that we're spending about probably between $19 and $21 per book. What we're going to go in and do is run a report and check on all the initial circs, not the renewals, just the initial circs. And so every circulation of that book, that's how much money we saved our community because those people didn't have to go out and buy those books. So it's so our investment is that we're buying this book and we're putting it out there so that people can come in and get it, and we're saving them thousands of dollars every year so that they can come in and just take the book out here and not have to go buy it. So this is one of our return on our investment that's actually impacting the community. We hope, and it turns out that it's been very popular in leisure reading collections. So if she wants more information, though, let me know.
Okay, and Michelle Price is asking what easy proxy data goes into your MySQL. Does it include usernames?
No, we don't include usernames. We do have the usernames, but what we do, we actually have a programmer, a systems librarian that does a lot of this, and I'm sure he'd be happy to help anybody who wanted to look into what he was doing. He'll probably kill me for saying that, but he will be happy to help. But what we do is we use the usernames just to match them up to a thing in the HR database, so we know not really who they are specifically, but we know what their department is. We know if they're clinical or non-clinical. We know if they're on campus or off campus. We know that kind of thing. But we don't actually keep track of usernames. We don't look to see who's using what specifically them. We just want to know, mostly are they clinical or non-clinical. It's very helpful to know, especially since our clinical resources are so expensive. We do try to keep track of how much of that's being used. And we like to know like what departments are coming from, because if we're getting people from one department a lot, we like to know like, well, what are we doing for you? That's great, so that we can repeat it for someone else. And then if we discover a trend where we don't see some departments at all, then we try to go out and meet with those people. So we do keep we use the user data just to match them up. But other than that, we like to have the IP address because we know if they're on campus or off campus, and we know what building they're in on campus. So we know if they're clinical or academic, just because either they're in a academic world or they're in the hospital. So that's the kind of data we use for that. But we also started collecting the search terms, which has been really kind of fun to see what people are searching, just to see how it's interesting to see how people use the databases. In a way, it's frustrating because we can't get to them to tell them, no, you're searching it wrong, but at least it's interesting to see like what the trends are, what kind of hot searches are for the day and that kind of thing. So that's been kind of interesting also. But that's what we take from the Easy Proxy.
And Susanna Gal said, can you, she said, we missed a few slides in the beginning and heard about the best slide ever, and we'd like to see it. Thanks.
Oh, sure. Let me see. What's the quickest way to get there? I found two really, I'm going to give everyone a tour of my slides. I'm sorry. I don't know this. Since I lost some of them, I don't have as many to get through to get back to it. Both of these slides are very good. Like this one is really great. This slide, I think, is one of the best visuals of outputs that I've ever seen. It's got trend data, and it's put together nicely, and it really is just output. So actually, Andy Morton, who created this, actually said, sure, go ahead, use it. I think they did a really nice job with this one. But another slide, this slide is actually very good, too. I think this is also one of my top favorite slides that I've ever seen. This one is all just outcomes. So if you look at the two slides together, it's a really good way of telling like what's an output and what's an outcome. But I think this slide is fantastic because it really just solidifies what the University of Arizona is doing for the state. It's got a lot of monetary data in there, and they're talking about creating jobs. And I think they did a really nice job. Like, this is a really good example of the kind of information. If you want to talk about your outcomes, this is the kind of information you want to put out there for people to know. Well, I know they have an advantage on us because they are an entire university and we are just libraries, but I think it's still a really good example of something to aspire to as far as letting people know what your outcomes are and how you're actually impacting your community. So those are my two best slides.
I think it's always great to see the data visually like that.
Yes, right. You know, it's fun. And I asked Andy Morton, who did this slide, I asked him what he used, and he said that he used partly one of the Easily sites where you go in and you can do your own thing, and then partly Photoshop. So it doesn't sound impossible. I'm going to attempt something similar here because I think it's so great.
I'm sure it takes a lot longer than it looks like it does.
Whenever it looks easy, you know that someone spent hours on it. That's the rule.
Definitely. Well, I don't see any other questions in the chat box, so do you mind if I share your email address? Because you had mentioned that people could email you.
Please do, because that was prominently on my version of the PowerPoint that is at home on my computer. It's supposed to be in Dropbox.
Okay. Well, we can also send out those updated slides to the registrants.
That's what I was hoping. So that's fantastic.
Yes. And then Susanna also wanted to know if we could put the days and times for upcoming webinars in the chat box. And what I'll do is I'll just send that out in a follow-up email to all of the registrants for today so they have that information. So thank you so much, Wendi.
Thank you. Thanks for bearing with me with my PowerPoint. world here. I appreciate it. And if anybody really has any questions, please do just let me know.
Sure, and thanks everyone for joining us today. And like I said, we'll be sending out a follow-up survey as well as a link to today's recording and information about any of the upcoming webinars. All right, have a good day everyone, and I will now end the webinar.
Thank you.